Hola a todos, soy un tío blancuetero y hoy tenemos una entrevista con BRET, WEINSTEIN, HEYING y su libro La guía del cazador recolector para el siglo XXI. Que para los que no lo recordáis, BRET WEINSTEIN fue introducido en este canal en uno de los primeros vídeos que saqué allá por 2018, que hablaba de la corrección política y de la polémica de Evergreen, en el que hablaba básicamente de la vergüenza internacional que fue el episodio de la Universidad de Evergreen, donde en marzo de 2017 los estudiantes tomaron la universidad prácticamente y amenazaron al profesor WEINSTEIN que impartía clases de biología. Todo empezó por una carta que había escrito objetando a los profesores de Evergreen sobre un cambio que habían ordenado en una tradición de décadas de la universidad que se llamaba el Día de la Ausencia, durante el cual tradicionalmente pues los estudiantes y profesores de minorías voluntariamente no asistían al campus a fin de destacar sus contribuciones a la universidad. El cambio anunciado alteraba el evento en su forma tradicional, pues lo que se pedía es que los estudiantes blancos no asistieran a la universidad mientras la programación de actividades en el campus se orientaba exclusivamente a personas de color. WEINSTEIN escribió que este cambio establecía un precedente peligroso y dijo: hay una gran diferencia entre un grupo que decide ausentarse voluntariamente de un espacio compartido para resaltar sus roles vitales subestimados y un grupo que anima a otro grupo a irse. Lo primero es una llamada contundente a la conciencia que, por supuesto, paraliza la lógica de la opresión. Lo segundo es una demostración de fuerza y un acto de opresión en sí mismo. A partir de ese momento, las protestas estudiantiles estallaron en denuncias de racismo, intolerancia y amenazas hacia el profesor, que junto con su esposa HEYING acabaron abandonando su puesto docente.
I am not interested in debate. I am interested only in dialectic, which does mean I listen to you and you listen to me.
All about him! On terms of white privilege. This is not a discussion. You have lost that one.
You said some racist shit. Can
I
you
did
apologize?
not. I did
Yes,
not.
you did.
Okay. You don't know. Yes, I know. History could pivot in the direction of the values that you are standing here for.
Yeah, resign.
What?
Resign.
I'm not resigning.
Okay.
If I owe an apology, I will deliver it.
Wait, hey.
These racist teachers have got to go. Hey, hey, ho, ho. These racist teachers have got to go. Black power, black power. Hey, hey, ho, ho. These racist teachers have got to go. Hey, ho, ho. These racist teachers have got to go. Hey, hey, ho, ho. These racist teachers have got to go. We are here to support. We want to dismantle anti-black discrimination.
So the priority is that they stay in that room. If they aren't in that room, then we did something wrong. So you need to watch that door, watch all the doors, watch the windows. You need to keep eyes on them. And somebody needs to go in that room real quick to make sure that there's no way in that room for them to leave.
The experiment in anarchy resulted in people who claimed that they were acting in self-defense, roving the campus, intimidating people literally with baseball bats. And there was an incident in which one person was hit. The person who was hit filmed it. And although it's nighttime and you can't see very much, it's extremely clear what happened.
Tras el escándalo, BRET WEINSTEIN acudió a numerosos podcasts como el de Joe Rogan, Sam Harris o Jordan Peterson, donde señaló la preocupante deriva de la academia americana y su sumisión al totalitarismo de corrientes posmodernas e irracionales que iba anidando cada vez más en nuestra cultura. Y estos días acaba de publicar un libro que creo que es muy necesario, que se llama Guía del cazador recolector para el siglo XXI, en el que junto con su mujer HEYING ahonda en los orígenes de la evolución humana y cómo esta contrasta con todos los avances tecnológicos que crecen a una enorme velocidad, lo que complica a nuestra biología y nuestros instintos más primarios el poder seguirle el paso. Y luego que si problemas de ansiedad, suicidios, salud mental, etcétera, etcétera, etcétera. Y con ello pues buscan el intentar poner solución a muchos de los problemas de nuestra vida moderna. Dentro de entrevista. I know you from the incident in Evergreen. I made a video about it and it was a very successful video because the incident was really grotesque. So the first thing, because that's one of the reasons, then I've been listening to you in several podcasts and I read your book that is Guía del cazador recolector para el siglo XXI. That's the name in Spanish. And I recommend to everyone, but that's not the thing. The first thing I wanted to say is, from your experience on Evergreen, what is your opinion right now from the state of academia in America, and how corrupted by ideology is in these moments, and if any of these had any consequence for you at the time of writing this book?
That's interesting. The corruption in higher education in the US and in the West more generally is almost beyond comprehension. We have a system of incentives that have turned scientists into salesmen and have caused professors to pander to political realities that are very destructive. And it would be funny if it weren't so dangerous to have lost this mechanism for discovering what is true and what its implications are. So the situation is very dire, and we cannot survive. Our culture cannot survive if we don't have something that does the job of the academy, which means that the failure of the academy is an emergency.
I will add, what happened so famously and, as you say, grotesquely at Evergreen in 2017 was a wake-up call for many people, in part because the young people who were really just tools of the so-called adults who were making it happen behind the scenes made the error of filming everything and putting it up on the web for everyone to see. So there were visuals to go with the stories that were already happening. But we're Gen Xers. We went to college in the late 80s and early 90s, and then we're in grad school in the 90s. And we were seeing this then. We were seeing a lot of the pieces of the puzzle that ended up tearing apart so many institutions, and maybe the entire institution writ large of higher ed, even back then. And the relationship between science and federal granting agencies and private organizations in the US and more widely in the weird world is a big part of it. The more famous part is how the humanities and social sciences have been taken over by an ideology that doesn't even believe in reality. And then we have sort of modern styles of parenting that have gone into education as well, which informs professors, as it did parents, that to disagree with children is somehow doing them harm. And so instead of educating students, college students and younger, we're telling them that everything that they do is great. We give them gold stars, and then we tell them they need to be angry at everyone but those of us who failed to educate them. So there are a tremendous number of forces at play here, but all of it leaves both of us, in terms of what we can see, really, really pessimistic about the state of higher ed.
Okay, that's sad. Any of that had any consequence for you at the time that you decide to write this book specifically? Because this book gets about like the origins of evolution for understanding like some problems that we have like right now in our lives. But I don't know if something related to the state of the academia pushed you to say like, okay, we have to do something, and writing books like this, it might help for people to understanding some things.
Not really, because the origin, so before Evergreen came apart so spectacularly, we were very successful professors, and we had a large community of students that were very dedicated to our style of thinking about evolution. And they, in fact, repeatedly asked us to write a book so that they could take some of what they were coming to understand from our programs and transmit it to family and friends. And I suppose after Evergreen had its meltdown, we had the opportunity to write the book, and we had the time to write it, but the origins of the book stretch way back into our classroom, where this was the subject matter that we were teaching.
I specifically remember, I can trace it back at least to 2011, when I remember teaching a comparative anatomy lab, and there were sharks and cats that students were dissecting. and having a conversation with a few of them about something that wasn't at all about shark or cat anatomy. It was, and I don't remember if it was about medicine or sex and gender or childhood or any of the other topics that are in the book, but it was about something that was still just as evolutionary as the sharks and the cats and their circulatory systems and digestive systems that were open in front of us. And I said to them then, yes, Brett and I should, and we would like to write a book. And indeed, we already had the title then. So the title that you read in Spanish, in English, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, is the title of a book that we have been talking about writing for over a decade at this point.
Okay, so then I want to ask you specifically about like your field of expertise, because you're like biologist and you're like evolution. I don't know if I'm saying this correct, but evolutionary biologist.
Evolutionary biologist.
Evolutionary biologist, thank you. And by my understandings on what is happening right now in academia, and like this field precisely, it might like very controversial. I don't know, there are some things, and I have written down, for example, in the book, like probably if we talk about the things that you say about diet, or the things that you say about sleeping, and things that might help everyone, almost no one could have problems with this. But in the time when we, for example, start talking about gender issues, of the difference between men and women from a biological point of view, that suddenly might be like super problematic.
The problem for us is that the evolutionary toolkit is extremely powerful for understanding the human condition. And not all of what it says is politically comfortable. Now, we believe that we are better off to understand what we are and not pretend that we are something else. But in effect, the ability to speak to the questions of sex, gender, race, human history, all of these important topics with a political dimension, the ability to speak to them with a powerful scientific toolkit that allows us to understand what is true and separate it from what is not true, it interferes with what a lot of people would like to accomplish. And so I don't think it is surprising that we, for example, ended up on the wrong end of a mob, because that mob was interested in gaining power on the basis of a story that we could tell was false.
Let me add, if I will. There's, I think, another kind of effect of the evolutionary thinking that we engage in that is actually very much at odds with a dominant way of thinking, an ideology that is common right now and popular right now. But because it doesn't grab the attention the way, for instance, that sex and gender do, it's gotten less attention. And I'm thinking specifically of transhumanism, the idea that we can grow beyond our need for our somatic selves and effectively become disembodied beings with all of what makes us human in perhaps synthetic bodies or no bodies at all. This is precisely at odds with our, again, depending on how you count, 3.5 billion years of evolution. There can be no separation. And so when we, for instance, talk about sleep in what might truly be understood to be the least politically fraught chapter in the entire book, still, the transhumanists would have a problem with the idea that actually sleep is doing a function that is absolutely necessary. And as recently as 20 years ago, people still would say, oh yeah, sleep is, you sleep when you die. It's not important to sleep. It's not doing anything. And we still don't know all of what it does. But part of what we're arguing is there's a lot of things that people are interested in disrupting right now because they get a short-term gain. And we don't actually have any idea what all of the benefits are of the relationships, of the dreams, of the traditional diet, right? We can begin to point now to say, actually, eating food that is as close to the place where it was grown and looks as much like it did when it was still an organism is probably the healthiest way to eat. But we still don't know all of the reasons that's true.
Les quiero preguntar, en el debate clásico de biología contra cultura, vuestra posición en el libro parece que es negar el debate, entrar en ese debate y entender que tanto biología como cultura estarían entrelazadas. ¿Les puedes preguntar si pueden ahondar un poco en esto?
Yes, we make a fundamental error trying to distinguish between biology and culture. The fact is, culture and genes are equally biological, and this is a very difficult fact to grasp. But once you understand that the genes have given us a mind that is inhabited by culture, which evolves, and that they did that for genetic reasons, things become much clearer. We are a species that can revolutionize our way of existing in the world without physically changing. We can do this through a software update process, and that is very good for the genes. It's why they built that system. So it's fine to distinguish between genes and culture, but it is a mistake to distinguish between biology and culture, because culture is biology.
The progress that we achieve in the last century, it's something tremendous. But all these material goods that we have achieved, more in the more advanced countries, it doesn't seem that comes with a good emotional well-being. Given this paradox, for example, there is double of suicides, for example, in Europe than in Africa. What, you know, if you look at this, you can see that in Africa, from a materialistic point of view, they have like a worse setting that we have in Europe, but in Europe we suicide double than in Africa. Why you think this will be happening?
I'm going to start with a story, with an anecdote. In the 1990s, I did a lot of research in Madagascar. I lived in Madagascar while I was doing my biological research. And Madagascar is near the bottom of the world's economies in terms of wealth. Most of the Malagasy have nearly nothing, and they can't even buy anything. And they subsist on almost entirely rice. And I brought one friend back a pair of shoes, a pair of nice hiking boots, because he admired mine when I came back the next time. And they were probably by far the nicest possession that he had ever owned in his life to that point. And they provided him a great amount of value because he was spending a lot of time walking and wearing out his feet. But when asked, many of the Malagasy, who, you know, this was pre-internet, they did not have a way to really see into the rest of the world. They had a sense of who the French were because the French had colonized and been kicked out in the late 60s, but they didn't really know, and they didn't know what our lives were like in the United States. They would say things to me like, well, you do seem to have a lot of things, but where is your family? Mm-hmm. And sometimes Brett and I were there together, and sometimes it was just me. And certainly I never took the rest of my family there, my parents, my brother. That's not how you do things when you're learning to be a biologist in the weird world in the 1990s. You don't travel with your family. But they were seeing something real, which was that I was, as many of us do, prioritizing my own intellectual development and over the family life that I had emerged from. And while the Malagasy were interested in having some of the things that I had, they were intrigued by Gore-Tex and by Velcro and by waterproof tarps and some very simple things that they just had no access to at all. They too could see that it seemed to have come with a trade-off. And indeed it had.
Mm-hmm. If I might add, because we upgrade our software and we change rapidly, our species does, we are in effect in the adolescence of our culture, where we are coming to understand that we have tremendous power to affect things, but we have no wisdom about when to do so and when to restrain ourselves. And the change that we pursue almost as an addiction has left us with a world of new things that we don't know yet how to feel about. And I would just say, in a world that works, in a world of our ancestors, even a world where there was not enough to eat, there was still a clarity about how to function because the world was an intuitive place, right? We all have had this sort of experience when there's something that we're very good at. If we're good at a sport and things are, if we're playing ping pong and it's going very well, you're not thinking your way through the game. You are just flowing your way through the game. That is what life should be like most of the time, by virtue of the fact that your software is a good match for your environment. You use your conscious mind when they are a mismatch, and we are left using our conscious mind for everything. Things that should be completely obvious, like if that tastes good, I should probably eat it. Well, that's not true anymore. In fact, if it tastes good, you might want to be very careful because you might have too much of it, or it might have been fine-tuned to taste good in order to trick you into eating it when it's not healthy. So we are forced to engage our conscious minds to puzzle through everything, or worse, just to go with our intuition and constantly be doing ourselves harm. And this results in a feeling of being out of control, a feeling that the choices that we have, none of them are good. And of course, it is not so surprising that people who don't have good choices sometimes make terrible choices, like suicide, as you point out.
Les quiero preguntar si, por ejemplo, cuestiones como la maternidad o el hecho de tener hijos y el hecho de que en los países llamados avanzados, en los países más prósperos, normalmente vengan acompañados con un descenso en la natalidad, si tiene alguna relación con estas cuestiones que ellos explicarían en el libro.
There are many of the causes are going to be social. People feeling no sense of hope about the future, and so not wanting to have children. People having no sense of economic security, and so not wanting to bring children into the world when until this generation, the story is in the United States anyway, until this generation, you could always expect to do better than your parents. And now that is not true. So there, and of course we are confused about sex and gender. And so there is a lot of sort of explicitly anti-natalist sentiment around the idea of parenting and of having children as being itself a bad choice. But there's also the endocrinological effects of what we are doing, both by choice to children's bodies and to our own bodies, by giving us prescription drugs, things like antidepressants and anti-anxiety meds and speed, more the former for girls and the latter for boys, all of which affect reproductive capacity and interest. And then the indirect effects of decades of agricultural chemicals and the chemicals that we pee out and go into our water supply that are effectively acting as endocrinological blockers or enhancers and rendering people with lower fertility. All of these, every one of these you can point to as hypernovelty or an effective hypernovelty. And some of it is clear, and presumably some of it we haven't even begun to think of yet.
I would actually turn the question on its head a little bit in order to see the ridiculousness of our circumstance. Prior to birth control, the fact that, think about it from evolution's perspective. Evolution is, at its core, a process that augments the tendency and capacity to spread one's genes, to put one's genes into the future. That has a lot to do with reproduction. So, things associated with reproduction are incentivized at the highest possible level, right? The desirability of sex is the most powerful motivator in the universe, at least for men, and probably for men and women for slightly different reasons. In the past, prior to birth control, women would have been extremely careful about who they engaged in reproductive behavior with, because human babies are so expensive to raise that the prospect of producing one with somebody who had no intent to participate in raising the child or providing resources was a terrible cost. Whereas men, if they could manage to produce an offspring that did not require them to participate in raising it, that's an evolutionary bargain. So there's an ancient tension between men's desire to produce offspring that have no cost and female desire not to be saddled with an offspring that did not have a partnership associated with it. What this caused was the evolution of a system in which men and women invest in offspring symmetrically, because females enforced that discipline. So the bottom line is, in the not so distant past, the incredibly powerful motivator provided by the desire for a sexual relationship and the rationality of females resulted in a system in which people engaged in certain behaviors. They achieved things in order to impress mates, to gain a relationship that would be worthy. And that all provided a direction to life that is now lost because these things have become under our control in a way that is unnatural. Right? Now this is all a very deliberate question. Am I going to have children or not? Whereas in the past, the natural inclination of people to partner, to have sex, would have produced children automatically. And so this is not supposed to be a deliberate choice. Now that it is one, we have to figure out how to reconstruct the system so it's sensible. But the idea that this should be driven by logic in the first place is new.
So I will say, just to tag onto that a little bit, that the decline in birth rates that we're seeing in the weird world now is relatively new, and it's far newer than reliable birth control. So what we, in the early decades, in the first decades of reliable birth control, and here I'm really talking about hormonal birth control. So let's, the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, when I came of age, and we were married and we have 2 children, and I was a college professor before we had our first child, and that wouldn't have been possible absent reliable birth control.
Yep.
It wouldn't have happened that way absent reliable birth control. And for that, I and we are extraordinarily grateful, as are presumably generations, legions of women and their partners and their families, such that they were allowed to actually explore their own identity and individuality and figure and make a life for themselves before having children themselves.
And achieve.
And achieve such that parenthood could come not at the cost of individual achievement, which for women, those things were always in trade-off relationship in a way that they were not in trade-off relationship for men. So this was extraordinary, and it is too simple to say, weren't the 90s the great moment? That it doesn't make sense. And yet we do have decades of reliable birth control where we didn't see this decline in birth rate. So, maybe I started at the end of the story and you went back, and I'm going to just point out that, back in that story where you were, Brett, birth rates many women, professional women especially, were pushing the age at which they first reproduced back, but they weren't necessarily not reproducing at all. I mean, some women certainly, and that has always been an option with less reliability. But there's new things afoot.
Well,
There's new confusions afoot in the last 5, 10, and 20 years that has to do with more prescription drugs being given to children and young adults that are confusing them, more ideological confusion around sex and gender, more screens, more bad helicopter parenting, just a number of things. Oh, and more time also, just to go back to my original answer, for the bioaccumulation of the phytoestrogens and the estrogens and such to accumulate in the water supply, such that we have actually both feminization of boys and to some degree masculinization of girls.
Yep, but there is also the radical shift in our culture. And the problem is that when the question arises, is it okay for people who have no interest in each other to have sex because they both want to? It's hard to explain what's wrong with that. Why shouldn't they? But when you have a system in which there's no stigma to that kind of interaction, it removes the incentive to partner. And absent the incentive to partner, it complicates the question of why should one desire to raise children? Should one raise them alone? So I'm not arguing that birth control is the only factor. I'm just arguing that what happened was a system that had its own logic built into it, a system that was deeply unfair to women, frankly, because it saddled them with child rearing and the responsibility for regulating it. So that unfair system got replaced by a system that liberated women, but removed the logic of the system that made life sensible. And so we have failed to replace that logic, and that's really what I'm arguing, is that in the absence of it, things don't work. We can't go back to the previous logic. It was unfair, and that ship has sailed. The question is, when do we replace it with some logic that makes enough sense to guide people?
Si no existe una preocupación de que todos esos avances que hemos conseguido, al no tener un impacto positivo de forma generalista en la forma en la que ahora mismo nos relacionamos y en la forma en la que ahora mismo pues tenemos nuestras relaciones y tal, no pueden ser utilizados como excusas por parte de reaccionarios para intentar volver a sistemas más antiguos y más injustos.
One of the things we try to make the point in the book is that we have abandoned the wisdom of the past too easily and too universally, but we cannot go back to it because it does not match our modern circumstances, and that the only way forward that is sensible is to attempt to figure out what part of the wisdom of the past is still relevant, in what way it might be updated, and in what way does it need to be replaced by new wisdom that we have yet to spell out. So it is the failure of unbridled progressivism and unbridled conservatism that is the focus of the book. We have to negotiate a new way of being that is sensible, draws on the strengths of the past, allows us to upgrade our situation based on the opportunities that exist, but without the cultural chaos that is making us sick physically, socially, and psychologically.
Habláis en el libro, que creo que está relacionado con esto, sobre el éxtasis del lactante. Perdona, traductora, por esto. El éxtasis del lactante, que es la tendencia que tiene el beneficio cortoplacista a ocultar el riesgo y el coste a largo plazo y a promover la aceptación incluso cuando el análisis final es negativo. Entonces, la pregunta sería, entiendo que a un nivel individual esto sería algo no relativamente complicado de hacer. Es decir, si yo, por ejemplo, pues quiero adelgazar, puedo eliminar un placer cortoplacista que podría tener, como sería pues pegarme una tremenda comilona y simplemente trabajar en un futuro que pueda ser bueno para mí. Y yo entiendo que eso a nivel individual no es algo demasiado complicado, aunque sí que pueda ir en contra de placeres más más inmediatos. Sin embargo, desde una perspectiva colectiva, me parece mucho más difícil, si no imposible de comprobar. ¿Sois optimistas en este sentido?
We do have hope, but there's a principle in evolutionary biology. We think of the landscape of opportunities as mountains and valleys, and we are on a low mountain, and we have to get to a higher mountain. And in order to get there, we will have to go through valleys. And so one way to interpret the chaos of the present is that this is the necessary breakdown of our system that is very dangerous. There's no guarantee that we will find the mountain on the other side of the valley, but there would be no way to get there that did not involve a coming apart of the prior dysfunctional system. So the book is really a call to consciousness, that recognizing the problem of hypernovelty, recognizing the danger of hypernovelty in the context of very dangerous technologies, and therefore the necessity for a new kind of wisdom that we don't have, should cause people to recognize, A, we are in this together. If we don't come up with that wisdom, one way or the other, the whole human project will come to an end. But B, that could be the gateway to a very vibrant new era in which we discover what the next phase of humanity looks like. So it's quite possible we'll miss it, but our hope in writing the book was to trigger that transition because it is overdue.
Ahora mismo existe un debate en España sobre la prohibición de la pornografía. Vuestra posición en el libro es anti pornografía. No sé si llegaríais hasta el punto de querer prohibirla, pero me pregunto si esto lo habéis contrastado, por ejemplo, con otros estudios como el de Michael Kastelman, que sacó una recopilación de estudios para el Psychology Today, que básicamente él llegaba a la conclusión de que la pornografía podía ayudar a aliviar que hubiese menos agresiones sexuales, entendiendo que esto podría servir como una válvula de escape para los agresores.
Porn brings with it the very real problem of there's one person observing other things happening to other people, and that is now what is in the live person's head about what's possible. And it both dehumanizes future partners of the person who is watching porn, and it also provides a slate of possibilities. So even if the porn we're talking about is gentle and woman-friendly, as much porn is not, as of course we know, but even if the porn we're talking about is, there are 7 things, let's say, in an individual video that are done, and that now becomes what the viewer, usually male, of the porn knows to do. And that will prompt a sort of rote kind of behavior of like, well, I saw that you do 1 first, and then you do 2, and then you do 3. And we know from all human interaction, especially sexually intimate interaction, but all human interaction, that the most interesting, the most exalted, the most wonderful, the most surprising ways to proceed are not by script. Not if 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. And not only should they not be by script, but there shouldn't be a set of ingredients that you're pulling from. Sexual intimacy, like conversation, uses some slate of things by which that you have. You have 2 bodies, you have a set of words that you could be using, but you could put them together in an infinite number of ways. And porn seems to both reduce the number of ways and then reduce in the mind of the person who's been viewing the porn the things that they think are possible, such that when they interact with a real person in an actual sexual encounter, it would seem to make that other person just like someone on a screen, not as a real partner.
I would take a little different approach to this question. We often get tangled because we skip the part where we define porn, which is where the problem is. Porn is erotic content for which the motivation for producing it is money. We don't take a position against erotica. Erotica has a very long history and is obviously an important part of human culture. The problem is when you put erotica into the context of a market where you have many producers trying to reach a consumer and get their attention using sex, which is basically, from the point of view of the producers, a generic fact, what it does is it drives competition into extreme forms of sex, taboo forms of sex. And so things that would have been fringe behaviors 20 years ago, for example, sexual violence, become normalized through this, not because they are normal, but because in order to get the attention of the consumer, they have to be put front and center. And this is affecting the way people treat each other and the way people understand sex. So this most powerful toolkit for building a romantic relationship is now infused with this antagonistic behavior as if that was the normal fact of human sex, which it is not. As long as you take the distinction between erotic content, which of course should be free to be explored as it has been throughout human history, and the commodity marketized version of that same thing, as long as you separate those, this is a much easier discussion to have.
Okay, would you prohibit it?
Prohibit?
Yeah.
Here's the question. Would I like it not to be a fact of the landscape? The market version? Absolutely. Is it worth the cost of prohibiting it? Can we define it so well that we can prohibit it without creating another harm? I don't know the answer to that question. Okay. But people should limit it from themselves. Maybe there should be a renaissance of erotic content not produced for money, and that would supplant the porn. But yes, I would say do not accept this product. It is dangerous to your sexual mind, and it is a hazard to your future partners.
Okay. Thank you very much. Heather Heying, Brett Weinstein, guía del cazador recolector para el siglo XXI. Quiero dar las gracias a la gente que me apoya, quiero dar las gracias a la gente que me sigue, a los que estáis suscritos al canal, a los que no os tiraría en mitad del Atlántico con un ancla atada al tobillo. Quiero dar las gracias a toda la gente que está en Twitch todos los días y que me apoya por ahí, a los que me apoyáis por PayPal, a los que me apoyáis por Patreon, a mis privilegiados, opresores, machirulos, señoros y otros tíos blancos hetero. No podría hacer esto sin vosotros. Es para mí un placer estar aquí todos los días hablándoos a todos vosotros de actualidad con un poquito de humor, representando a la calvocracia asertiva. Nada más, eso es todo. Un honor, un saludo y hasta otra.